Augustine Devereux had been cataloging the city's slave registries for 3 months when he noticed something that made his hands shake. The clerk at the municipal courthouse had handed him a faded ledger dated July 1842, and there, in meticulous handwriting, were the birth records of 17 enslaved children, all born within a 3-month span, all from different plantations, all described with the same unsettling notation. Striking resemblance to prominent citizen. The names of those citizens weren't listed. But someone had tried to burn this specific page, stopping just short of destroying it completely. Before we continue with the story of what Augustine found in those archives, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what secrets your own city might be hiding? Drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. And if you're ready to uncover one of the darkest, most carefully buried scandals in American history, hit that subscribe button, because what we're about to reveal will change how you see the antebellum South forever. Augustine Devereux wasn't supposed to find anything controversial. The Massachusetts Historical Society had sent him to New Orleans in the spring of 1891 with a simple mandate. Document the city's administrative records before they deteriorated beyond repair. At 43, Augustine was known for his methodical nature and discretion, qualities that had made him the society's preferred researcher for sensitive historical matters. He had excavated family scandals before, uncovered forgotten debts and hidden marriages. But nothing had prepared him for what lay waiting in the basement archives of the New Orleans Civil District Court. The journey south had taken 6 days by train, and Augustine remembered watching the landscape change through the window. The ordered cities of the Northeast giving way to sprawling farms, then to something wilder, more overgrown. By the time he reached Louisiana, the air itself felt different, thick and sweet with decay. New Orleans had welcomed him with rain, warm torrents that flooded the streets and sent rats scurrying from the gutters. His boarding house on Dauphine Street smelled of mildew and chicory coffee, and the landlady, a widow named Mrs. Fontenot, had looked at him with dark, knowing eyes when he mentioned his work at the courthouse. "You be careful what you dig up in that place," she'd said, her Creole accent softening the warning. "This city, she keeps secrets for a reason. Some things they meant to stay buried." Augustine had smiled politely, dismissing it as local superstition. He was a man of facts, of documentation and verification. Ghost stories and dark warnings had no place in historical research. The courthouse itself was a grand structure with columns that had once been white, but had grayed with time and humidity. Inside, the halls echoed with footsteps, and the air hung heavy with the smell of old paper and wood rot. The current clerk, a thin man named Thibodeau with yellowed teeth and a nervous habit of tapping his fingers against any available surface, had seemed almost relieved when Augustine requested access to the antebellum slave records. "Nobody's looked at those in decades," Thibodeau had said, leading him down narrow stairs into a basement that smelled of mildew and something sweeter, more cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. "Most folks prefer to forget. The city's moved on, you understand. What's the point of digging up old bones?" "Historical preservation," Augustine had replied. "These records tell us about commerce, about family structures, about the economic foundation of—" "They tell us we were monsters," Thibodeau had interrupted, his voice flat. "That's what they tell us, but you go ahead and look. Just don't expect anyone to thank you for what you find." The basement archive was larger than Augustine had expected. Room after room of floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with ledgers, loose documents, rolled maps, and boxes of correspondence. Some sections were well organized, carefully labeled by year and type. Others were chaos, papers stuffed into crates, water-damaged volumes stacked haphazardly, folders bursting with documents that had been shoved in without regard for order. Augustine had started methodically, as he always did. He began with the standard documentation, bills of sale, transfer records, estate inventories. Slavery had been abolished for nearly 30 years, but its bureaucratic skeleton remained, carefully preserved in leather-bound volumes that detailed human beings as property, with the same clinical precision used for livestock and furniture. The first week, he simply familiarized himself with the record-keeping systems. New Orleans had been under French rule, then Spanish, then French again before the Louisiana Purchase brought it into American hands. Each administrative change had left its mark on the documentation. Different languages, different formats, different levels of detail. By 1830, the records had standardized somewhat, adopting the American preference for exhaustive documentation. He had seen such records before in other southern cities, Charleston, Richmond, Savannah. What made New Orleans different was the sheer volume, the meticulous detail, and something else he couldn't quite identify at first. A sense of performance, perhaps. As if the documents were meant not just to record transactions, but to communicate something else, some subtext that he was missing. The notations began to stand out in the second week. Small marks in the margins, abbreviations that didn't match the standard legal shorthand of the period. FDR appeared frequently, as did PA and BA. Some entries had small symbols drawn next to them, a star, a circle, a cross. Augustine made notes, thinking they might be clerk's marks, administrative codes for filing or categorization. But the pattern was wrong. The symbols appeared on specific types of transactions. Children listed without mothers, mothers listed as deceased shortly after giving birth yet showing up alive on other plantations years later. Sale prices that made no economic sense. Some children valued at 5 times the normal rate. Others given away for $1 or marked as charitable transfer. One afternoon in his third week, Augustine found himself staring at a bill of sale for a 6-year-old boy named Benjamin, transferred from the Riverside plantation to a buyer in Natchez, Mississippi. The price, $1. The notation in the margin, FDR, urgent. Below, in different handwriting, someone had added, family discretion required. That phrase appeared again and again as Augustine dug deeper. Family discretion required. Private arrangement, benefactor anonymous. And then there were the physical descriptions, unusually detailed for slave records of children. Light-skinned, angular features, gray eyes, prominent nose, auburn hair, tall for age. Remarkable resemblance noted by assessor. Resemblance to whom? Augustine started cross-referencing the plantation names with ownership records, building a database of who owned which properties when. He made charts, drew connections, looked for patterns. Riverside Plantation belonged to the Beaumont family, old money, with ties to the state legislature. Cedar Hill was owned by Judge Harold Sinclair, who had served on the state Supreme Court for 15 years. Magnolia Terrace, Belle Grove, Oakmont. Each one connected to names that appeared in the society pages, political appointments, commercial directories. It was Thibodeau who had brought him the burned ledger, though at first Augustine didn't realize what made it significant. The clerk had appeared at his desk one afternoon in late June, carrying a volume with charred edges wrapped in brown paper. His hands had been shaking slightly as he set it down. Found this stuck behind a cabinet during cleaning, he'd said, his voice carefully neutral. 4th floor, in the old tax assessor's office. Thought you might want it for completeness. He'd started to leave, then paused at the door. Mr. Devereaux, if anyone asks what you're looking at down here, maybe don't mention everything. Some of the families, the old families, they still have influence, and they don't like surprises. Augustine had nodded absently, already unwrapping the package. The ledger's cover was partially burned, the leather blackened and cracked. Someone had doused a fire before it could consume the entire volume, but the damage was significant. The first 20 pages were destroyed, reduced to brittle black fragments. But pages 21 through 67 had survived, their edges brown, but their contents legible. The ledger covered births registered between April and June of 1842, a period that should have been routine. But as Augustine read through the entries, his trained eye caught the anomaly immediately. 17 children, all born to enslaved mothers on different plantations, scattered across Orleans Parish and the surrounding areas, all described with variations of the same phrase. Child bears notable resemblance, features reminiscent of prominent person. Striking similarity observed by registrar. And in each case, where the father's name would typically be listed as unknown or left blank, someone had written a number, just a number between 1 and 8. The numbers were written in the same hand as the rest of the entry, suggesting they were part of the original registration, not added later. Augustine felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't a filing system or administrative code. This was something else, something deliberate. He pulled out a map of the parish and began marking the plantations. Bell Grove, 17 miles upriver. Magnolia Terrace, south near the Delta. Riverside, Cedar Hill, Oakmont, Clearwater, Ashland, each one a substantial property, most of them owned by men whose names Augustine recognized from the society pages and political records he'd already reviewed. Senator Richard Valmont owned 3 of them. Judge Harold Sinclair owned 2. Congressman Thomas Beauchamp had inherited Riverside from his father. Marcus Delacroix, who owned the largest banking house in the city, controlled Magnolia Terrace and 2 smaller properties. The names went on, a roster of the city's most powerful families. But these men weren't the connection. The numbered notations pointed somewhere else. Augustine spent the rest of that day and all of the next pulling every document he could find from early 1842, legislative records, court proceedings, newspaper archives, business registries. He was looking for men who had reason to visit multiple plantations, who moved in the highest circles, whose presence across different properties might explain why 17 children born in the same 3 months would all be noted for their resemblance to someone. As the courthouse clock struck 9 on his second evening of intensive searching, Augustine found the first match. Number 3 appeared in 7 of the birth records. He traced it back through property transactions, tax documents, and finally to a legislative report. Jonathan Cartwright, a state legislator who had served on the Committee on Agriculture and Labor. In January of 1842, Cartwright had personally led a health and welfare survey of slave quarters across Orleans Parish, part of a state mandate to assess living conditions and productivity. The survey had been conducted in January. The children marked with number 3 were all born in April and May, 9 months. Augustine's throat went dry. He pulled the legislative report and read through the list of plantations inspected. Bell Grove, Cedar Hill, Riverside, Oakmont, Clearwater, Magnolia Terrace, Ashland. Every single property where a child marked with number 3 had been born. His hands were shaking as he checked the other numbers against legislative records, committee assignments, judicial circuits. Number 1 was Judge Harold Sinclair, who rode circuit to plantations across 3 parishes every February and March, conducting legal reviews of property deeds and business contracts. Number 2 was Senator Richard Valmont, who had chaired a commission on plantation productivity in late 1841 and early 1842. Number 5 was Thomas Beauchamp, then a young attorney who traveled frequently to negotiate labor contracts and settle estate matters. Each number corresponded to a man. Each man had documented reasons for visiting the plantations where children were born 9 months later. And each of those men was among the most respected, most powerful figures in Louisiana politics. 17 children. 8 men. All of them officials who should have been protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them. And someone had tried to burn the only record that connected them. Augustine locked the ledger in his document case that night and walked back to his boarding house through streets that suddenly felt hostile. Gas lamps cast wavering shadows that seemed to reach for him. The usual evening sounds, music from taverns, voices from open windows, the clatter of carriages, took on a sinister quality. Every footstep behind him might be someone following. Every figure in a doorway might be watching. He was being paranoid, he told himself. These events had happened 50 years ago. The men involved were old or dead. This was historical research, nothing more. But the burned ledger suggested otherwise. Someone had tried to destroy this evidence, and recently enough that the fire damage was still visible, the char still black, rather than faded to grey, which meant someone still cared about keeping these secrets buried. Mrs. Fontenot was sitting in the parlour when he arrived, unusual for that hour. She looked up from her sewing as he entered. "You look pale, Mr. Devereaux. You finding things in that courthouse that trouble you?" "Just tired," he said. "Long day." She set down her sewing and fixed him with that knowing stare. "My mother worked in a big house on Esplanade Avenue. The master there, he was a judge. Respected man, went to mass every Sunday, gave money to orphanages." She paused. "My mother said the quarters behind that house were full of children who had his eyes, his nose, his way of standing. Everyone knew. The mistress knew, the other servants knew, the neighbors knew. But nobody said a word. Not in public. Not where it could matter." "Why not?" Augustine asked, though he was beginning to understand. "Because saying it out loud, that would make it real. That would require action. Better to pretend not to see, to look away, to let it be someone else's problem." She picked up her sewing again. "This city's built on things people chose not to see, Mr. Devereaux. You go pulling back that curtain, you best be prepared for what you find underneath." Augustine didn't sleep well that night. He kept thinking about the numbers, about the careful code that let people document crimes while maintaining deniability. If anyone questioned the entries, they were just administrative marks. But to someone who knew who had the key, they told the whole story. Who had created this system? Who had decided that these births needed to be recorded but encrypted? And most importantly, who else knew how to read it? The next morning, he returned to the archives with new urgency. If this pattern existed in 1842, it might exist in other years. He began pulling birth registers from the entire decade, then expanded to the 1830s, then to estate records, sale documents, anything that might show more of the picture. What he found made the 1842 entries look like a single thread in a vast, dark tapestry. The pattern went back decades. Not every year, but regularly enough that it couldn't be coincidence. Clusters of children born in specific seasons, marked with those same cryptic notations, their physical descriptions unusually detailed for slave records. These weren't standard administrative descriptions, they were portraits, carefully worded to communicate something specific to anyone who knew how to read them. In 1838, there were 12 children marked with numbers between 1 and 5. Augustine traced number 2 that year to a state senator named William Foster, who had toured plantations as part of an agricultural development initiative. All the children marked with his number were born 9 months after his tour. In 1840, 19 children spread across 2 parishes marked with numbers 1 through 7. Number 4 belonged to a wealthy merchant named Charles Beauregard, who bought and sold plantation supplies and visited dozens of properties each year. In 1845, 11 children, numbers 1 through 4. In 1847, 15 children, numbers 1 through 6. Year after year, the pattern repeated. Clusters of births following visits by powerful men, all carefully documented with a code that preserved the evidence while protecting the guilty. Augustine began calculating. If there were roughly 15 marked children per year, and the pattern extended from at least 1838 to 1852, the last year before the record-keeping system changed, that meant over 200 children. And those were just the ones whose records had survived, the ones where the connection was clear enough to document. How many others had there been? How many children born without being marked, or marked in ways he didn't recognize? How many records had been destroyed before he got there? The scope of it was staggering. This wasn't a few isolated incidents. This was systematic, organized, protected by a bureaucracy that had created an entire coding system to track it while maintaining plausible deniability. Augustine found himself working with a new intensity, barely sleeping, eating meals at his desk. Thibodeau brought him documents without being asked now, appearing silently and leaving brown-wrapped packages that always contained exactly what Augustine needed next. The clerk never explained how he knew what to bring, and Augustine never asked. There was an understanding between them, a shared recognition that this work mattered, that someone needed to bear witness. One afternoon in July, Thibodeau lingered after delivering a packet of papers. The archive was empty except for the 2 of them, and the clerk's usual nervous energy had settled into something quieter, more serious. "My grandmother worked at Magnolia Terrace," he said, his eyes fixed on the wall behind Augustine. "She was brought there as a girl, maybe 13 years old, worked in the house, helping with cooking and cleaning. She told me once that the house girls knew when the inspections were coming. They knew to disappear into the fields, to suddenly take sick, to do anything to avoid being seen." He paused, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against his leg. "The ones who couldn't hide, or who were chosen anyway." He stopped, swallowed. "My grandmother said they learned to go quiet inside themselves, to be somewhere else in their minds while it happened, and afterward, if there were consequences, if a child came—" Another pause. "The mistress of the house, she would arrange for the woman to be sold away, always phrased as punishment for some invented infraction, but everyone knew the real reason. Can't have evidence walking around, can't have children who look like ghosts of the master's legitimate family." "Ghosts?" Augustine asked. "That's what they called them, the ghost children, because you couldn't talk about them, couldn't acknowledge what was right in front of your eyes. They were there and not there at the same time, visible but invisible." Thibodeau finally looked at Augustine. "She said the newspapers never wrote about it. Said there was an understanding between the papers and the families. The editors, the politicians, the big planters, they were all the same people, you understand? You didn't write about your own." "An understanding," Augustine repeated, thinking about the silence he'd found in the newspaper archives. "Everyone benefited from the silence," Thibodeau continued. "The politicians kept their reputations, the newspapers kept their advertisers and their social standing. The white women of the households could pretend their husbands were faithful. And the men," his voice turned bitter, "the men got to do whatever they wanted without consequence." After Thibodeau left, Augustine sat in the silent archive and thought about all the historical records he'd ever studied, all the documents he'd carefully catalogued and preserved. How much of history was what people chose to write down, and how much was determined by what they chose to ignore? How many crimes had been committed in plain sight, documented in coded language, hidden behind bureaucratic systems that made them invisible? He began searching newspaper archives next, hoping to find some reference, some oblique mention that might corroborate what he was finding in the birth records. The Times-Picayune, the Daily Crescent, the True Delta, the Commercial Bulletin. New Orleans had been a city of newspapers, competing publications that covered everything from shipping news to society gossip. Augustine read through society pages, birth announcements, political coverage, crime reports. The silence was absolute. In a city whose newspapers documented every society wedding, every political appointment, every minor scandal involving merchants or shopkeepers, there was not a single mention of enslaved children resembling their owners or their owners' associates. Not one letter to the editor questioning the presence of light-skinned children on plantations. Not one editorial about the moral implications. Not even the coded, euphemistic language that Victorian society often used to discuss uncomfortable topics. It was as if an entire category of reality had been agreed upon as non-existent. But there were other patterns in the news, patterns that only became visible when you knew what to look for. Stories that appeared, then vanished. He found a 2-paragraph piece from May 1843 about a disturbance at a plantation in St. Charles Parish, where enslaved workers had refused to labor and made unseemly accusations against parties of quality. The story ran once on page 7, then was never mentioned again, unusual for a paper that typically followed up on labor disputes, property damage, and any threat to the social order. When Augustine searched the court records, he found no trial, no resolution, no further documentation. The incident had simply stopped existing in the official record. He found similar ghost stories scattered across the decade, brief mentions of irregular claims withdrawn before reaching court, of unsubstantiated charges dismissed by magistrates, of workers removed to distant properties for disciplinary purposes, with no explanation of what discipline was required. Each story appeared once and disappeared, leaving no trace except that single mention, easily overlooked, easily forgotten. Someone had been systematically silencing these stories. But the question that haunted Augustine as he worked deeper into the summer was, why keep the birth ledgers at all? If the newspapers could be controlled, if court records could vanish, if entire incidents could be erased from public memory, why maintain these detailed registries that documented exactly what they wanted hidden? The answer came from an unexpected source. In mid-August, on a day so hot and humid that the archive felt like a steam bath, a young man appeared at the courthouse, asking for Augustine by name. He was well dressed in a way that spoke of careful economy, good quality clothes that had been maintained meticulously rather than replaced when fashions changed. His skin was light brown, his features sharp and distinctive. He carried himself with quiet confidence, despite the fact that his presence in the courthouse drew stares from clerks and visitors. He handed Augustine a card that read, Jacques Levesque, Private Inquiry Agent. Mr. Devereaux, Levesque said, his voice cultured, his English carrying just a trace of French inflection. I believe we have mutual interests. They met that evening at a cafe far from the courthouse, in the Treme neighborhood where a mixed-race man and a white researcher could talk without drawing unwanted attention. The cafe was small, dim, with tables tucked into corners that offered privacy. Levesque had chosen a spot in the back, away from windows. He had brought his own documents, letters, photographs, carefully compiled genealogies written in a precise hand. The papers were organized in folders, each labeled with a year and a name. Mr. Devereaux, Levesque began, I need to know whether I can trust you, whether what you're doing in that courthouse is genuine historical research or something else. Genuine, Augustine said. The Massachusetts Historical Society sent me to document. I know why they sent you. What I need to know is what you plan to do with what you're finding. Levesque's eyes were intense, searching. Because if you're just collecting scandal for some academic journal, if you're planning to publish sensational stories that will be read and forgotten, then I'm wasting both our time. Augustine thought about the burned ledger, about Thibodeau's warnings, about the pattern of silence he'd uncovered. I don't know yet what I'm going to do, he admitted, but I know that what I've found needs to be preserved. These records document crimes, systematic crimes committed by people in positions of power. That matters. It should matter. Levesque studied him for a long moment, then nodded. My mother was born at Cedar Hill Plantation in June of 1844. She was noted in the registry as bearing remarkable resemblance to benefactor. The number beside her entry was 6. Number 6. Augustine had traced that number to Marcus Delacroix, the banker who controlled half the commercial lending in New Orleans. When I was young, Levesque continued, my mother told me about the ghost children. She said there were dozens of us, maybe hundreds, scattered across Louisiana and the territories where people had been sold. Children who looked like senators and judges, like the men who wrote laws saying we were property. She said our existence was the truth they couldn't afford to let anyone speak. He laid out photographs on the table. Men and women, children and adults, spanning different decades. Some of the photographs were formal studio portraits, expensive and carefully composed. Others were simpler, taken with hand cameras, showing people in everyday settings. I've been finding them, Levesque said. The ones who survived, the ones who stayed in Louisiana, the descendants. We all have the records, the birth ledgers, the sale documents with our faces described in detail. Some of us were sold away immediately, to distant plantations where we wouldn't be seen by the wrong people. Others were kept close, sometimes in the same households as our father's legitimate children, invisible in plain sight. His voice was steady, professional, but Augustine could see the tension in his hands as he arranged the photographs. My mother was raised at Cedar Hill until she was 8 years old. Then she was sold to a family in Baton Rouge. No explanation, no warning. One day she was there, the next day she was on a boat heading upriver. She didn't understand why until she was older, until she realized she looked too much like someone important, someone whose wife might start asking questions. Augustine looked at the photographs. The people in them bore the features Levesque had described. Light skin, European features, expressions that seemed to carry a weight of knowledge, of secrets held close. "Why are you telling me this?" Augustine asked. "What do you want from me?" "Proof," Levesque said simply. "I have family stories, I have photographs, I have memories, but I don't have official documentation. The birth records, the sales, the coded numbers, those are legal documents. They can't be dismissed as fabrication or false memory. If you can prove the pattern, if you can show the system, then maybe—" He stopped, gathered himself. "Maybe it will mean something. Maybe someone will have to acknowledge what happened. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the conspiracy deepens. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next." Over the following weeks, Augustine and Levesque worked together, combining the official records with the human stories behind them. Levesque brought people to meet Augustine. Elderly men and women who had been born into slavery, younger people who carried the legacy in their features and their family histories. There was Marie Toussaint, a seamstress in her 50s who had been born at Belle Grove Plantation in 1839. Her mother had been sold to Cuba when Marie was 3 months old. Marie had been raised by her grandmother, who told her stories about her mother, how she had been quiet and gentle, how she sang while she worked, how she disappeared one day and never came back. "My grandmother said my mother was chosen because she was pretty," Marie told Augustine, her voice matter-of-fact but her eyes distant. "When the inspectors came through, the pretty girls were the ones who caught attention. My grandmother tried to keep my mother hidden, made her work in the laundry where it was hot and steamy and no one looked too close. But someone saw her, and 9 months later, there I was." She showed Augustine a small leather folder containing 2 items, a photograph of herself as a young woman and a newspaper clipping of State Senator Thomas Beauchamp at his daughter's wedding in 1870. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same high forehead, the same set of the eyes, the same slight asymmetry to the mouth. "I saw him once," Marie said. "I was working as a maid in a hotel on Canal Street, and he came in for some political dinner. He walked right past me, looked straight at me, and there was this moment. I saw him recognize the resemblance. I saw it in his eyes. And then he looked away and kept walking like I was furniture, like I wasn't even human enough to acknowledge." There was Philippe Arnaud, a school teacher who had traced his lineage back to Magnolia Terrace, and a woman named Rose who had been sold to Texas in 1843, shortly after giving birth. Philippe had copies of the bills of sale, had tracked the ship manifests, had found records in Galveston of Rose being purchased by a cotton plantation and dying there in 1851 at the age of 29. "She never saw her child again," Philippe said. "My grandfather. He was raised by another woman on the plantation, grew up not knowing who his mother was. It wasn't until after emancipation, when people started trying to find their families, that he learned what had happened, that his mother had been sent away because he looked too much like Marcus Delacroix. There was Catherine Broussard, whose mother had been born at Riverside Plantation and who had kept detailed written records of her family history, passed down through 3 generations. Catherine had ledgers documenting births, deaths, sales, a parallel archive created by the enslaved themselves, proof that they had paid attention, that they had remembered when the official record chose to forget. "My great-grandmother started keeping these records," Catherine explained, showing Augustine pages of careful handwriting, dates and names meticulously recorded. "She said if the white people wouldn't tell the truth, then we would tell it ourselves. We would remember. Even if we had to keep it secret, even if we couldn't say it out loud, we would know. And someday, maybe it would matter." Each person Levesque brought had the same story with different details. Mothers sold away, children scattered, families destroyed to protect the reputations of powerful men. And in every case, there were records. Not just the official documents that Augustine had found, but private letters, diaries, bills of sale carefully preserved, photographs taken when photography became accessible to working people. Together, they began building a comprehensive case. Augustine would find an entry in the courthouse records, a child born in a specific month and year, marked with a number described with unusual detail. Levesque would connect it to a person, a family, a story. They cross-referenced dates with legislative sessions, judicial circuits, business records. They mapped out the movements of the numbered men, showing how their official duties gave them access to plantations across the region. The pattern was irrefutable. Between 1835 and 1852, at least 237 children had been born to enslaved women and marked with the coded numbering system. The actual number was certainly higher. These were just the cases where the documentation was clear and had survived. But the most disturbing discovery came when Augustine and Levesque began tracing what happened to the mothers. Augustine had noticed the death records early on, unusually high mortality rates among enslaved women in the year following those documented births. But when he cross-referenced the names with sale records, shipping manifests, and plantation inventories, he found something darker. Many of the women listed as deceased in plantation records appeared on manifests for ships bound for Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, Brazil. They had been sold away within weeks or months of giving birth, their children left behind. The deaths were fictions, administrative erasures designed to sever any connection between mother and child, to eliminate anyone who might tell the story, who might make accusations that couldn't be ignored. They were witnesses, Levesque said quietly when they discovered the pattern. The only ones who could testify to paternity. So they made them disappear. Augustine found bills of sale for women sold to plantations in distant territories, places far enough away that they could never return, never contradict the official story, never seek their children. Some sales were marked special transport or urgent transfer, with prices that suggested panic rather than economic calculation. The mothers had been exiled for knowing too much, for being evidence of crimes that could destroy political careers and family dynasties. One evening in late August, Augustine and Levesque sat in the archive after hours, surrounded by decades of documentation. They had compiled enough evidence to fill 3 large crates: copies of birth records, bills of sale, photographs, written testimonies, cross-references showing the movements of the numbered men. "What are you going to do with this?" Levesque asked. "Will you publish? Will you tell the world what you've found?" Augustine had been wrestling with that question for weeks. "If I publish, what happens? The families will deny everything. They'll say the records are forgeries or misinterpretations. They'll destroy my professional reputation, claim I'm fabricating scandal to make a name for myself." "So you do nothing?" There was no accusation in Levesque's voice, only exhaustion. "I preserve it," Augustine said. "I make sure this evidence survives, gets catalogued properly, can't be easily destroyed. And when the time is right, when it can't be suppressed, when will that time be?" Levesque interrupted. "These men are dying, Mr. Devereux. Their sons are dying. In another 20 years, everyone directly involved will be gone, and people will say it doesn't matter anymore. It's ancient history. When is the right time to demand accountability?" Augustine had no answer. He thought about Thibodeau's warning, about the clerks who had disappeared for trying to bring these records to light. He thought about the burned ledger, about the systematic silencing he'd documented. The truth mattered, but so did survival. What good would it do to publish revelations if he ended up floating in Lake Pontchartrain? "Help me understand something," Augustine said. "Why keep the records at all? Why create this numbering system? Why document these births in detail if they wanted it all hidden?" Levesque smiled without humor. "Insurance. Power. Think about it. Every one of those men could be destroyed by what they'd done. If you were in a position to threaten them, if you had this evidence, you could control their votes, influence policy, extort money, ruin them completely. The records weren't meant to be public. They were meant to be leverage. Leverage for whom? Whoever controlled the records. The clerks who maintained them, the families who inherited the knowledge, anyone who knew where to look and how to read the code." Levesque gestured at the stacks of documents around them. This city runs on secrets and blackmail, Mr. Devereaux, always has. The official story's what gets published in the newspapers, what gets taught to children. But the real power comes from knowing what's hidden underneath. That night, Augustine lay awake in his boarding house room, thinking about power and silence, about the machinery that had kept these crimes hidden for decades. The numbered men had committed their acts with impunity because they controlled the systems that should have held them accountable. The courts, the newspapers, the economic structures that gave them access to vulnerable people. And those systems had protected them even after death. Their descendants inherited not just wealth and position, but the architecture of silence that made scrutiny impossible. In September, things began to change. Augustine noticed he was being followed. It started subtly, the same face appearing in different locations, a man in a grey coat who seemed to be wherever Augustine went. Outside his boarding house in the morning. Across the street from the courthouse at lunchtime. In the cafe where he sometimes ate dinner, he mentioned it to Levesque, who took the threat seriously. "We knew this would happen," Levesque said. "You've been too visible, spending too much time in the archives. People talk, clerks gossip. Someone's noticed what you're researching." They started taking precautions. They varied their meeting locations, stopped meeting at the courthouse, communicated through notes left at agreed-upon drops. Augustine began making copies of the most important documents, storing them in different locations. He rented a room across town under a false name, filled it with duplicates of his research. Thibodeau became increasingly nervous, his finger-tapping constant, his eyes darting to the door whenever someone entered the archive. One afternoon he pulled Augustine into a side room, his voice barely above a whisper. "They know what you're doing," he said. "The families. They have people watching the archives, tracking what documents you request. They know about your meetings with Levesque, about the people he's been bringing to see you." "How do you know this?" Augustine asked. "Because they came to me, offered me money to report everything you find, to slip them copies of your notes." Thibodeau's hands were shaking. "I told them I didn't know what you were researching, that I just pulled files like I would for any historian. But they didn't believe me. They know my family's history with these records." "What history?" Thibodeau closed his eyes. "My grandfather was a clerk here. In 1849, he tried to bring attention to what was in these records. He went to a newspaper, showed them evidence. 2 weeks later, he disappeared. They found his body in the river a month after that, ruled it an accident, a drowning. But my family knew better." "And your father?" Augustine asked. "Became a clerk like his father, kept his head down, maintained the records, never said a word about what they contained. He taught me the same, preserve, protect, but never reveal. Not until the time was right, not until someone came who couldn't be intimidated or bought off." "You think I'm that person?" "I think you're from Massachusetts," Thibodeau said. "You're not tied to these families, not dependent on their goodwill. You can leave this city and take the truth with you. That makes you dangerous to them, and when you become dangerous to powerful people..." He didn't finish the sentence. That evening, Augustine wrote a detailed letter to the Massachusetts Historical Society, documenting everything he'd found. He included copies of the most damning records, carefully photographed by Levesque using a camera borrowed from a friend who did commercial photography. He mailed the letter himself from 3 different post offices, sending duplicate copies to ensure at least one would arrive. The response came faster than he expected, but not from Massachusetts. A delegation arrived at his boarding house 3 days later, 3 well-dressed men who introduced themselves as representatives of concerned parties with interests in Louisiana's historical reputation. They were polite, even gracious. The eldest, a silver-haired man with cold eyes and an expensive suit, did most of the talking. "Mr. Devereaux, we understand you've been conducting research into some sensitive historical matters. We appreciate scholarly dedication, we truly do. But we're concerned that you may have misinterpreted certain documents, drawn conclusions that aren't supported by the evidence." They were sitting in Mrs. Fontenot's parlor. The landlady had made herself scarce, but Augustine could hear her moving around in the kitchen, staying close enough to intervene if needed. "I've drawn conclusions based on clear patterns in the documentation," Augustine said carefully. "Birth records, sales, coded notations that correspond to specific individuals. The evidence is substantial." "Evidence of what exactly?" The silver-haired man smiled. "You've found some unusual record-keeping practices from 50 years ago. You've noticed that certain children were described in detail, that certain transactions followed patterns. But you're interpreting those patterns through a modern lens, imposing meaning that may not have existed. I'm interpreting systematic documentation of nothing that can be proven," the man interrupted smoothly. "You have numbers beside names. You have birth records. You have nothing connecting those numbers to specific individuals except your own speculation. And speculation, Mr. Devereaux, is not history." They offered him money then, substantial money, phrased as a research stipend from a philanthropic foundation interested in accurate historical preservation. $5,000 to conclude his research and return to Massachusetts. Another $5,000 when he published his findings that would focus on record-keeping practices and administrative systems rather than on unsupported allegations against deceased individuals who cannot defend themselves. Augustine refused. They increased the offer. He refused again. Their tone changed. "Mr. Devereaux, you're examining events from half a century ago. Everyone directly involved is dead or nearly so. The enslaved people you're trying to defend have been free for 30 years. What purpose does it serve to drag up ancient pain, to destroy the reputations of families who are trying to move forward? Truth serves its own purpose," Augustine replied. "Truth?" The man's smile faded. "Truth is what we decide to remember. History is what gets written down and believed. These records you're studying, they're anomalies, clerical errors, administrative peculiarities. You're seeing patterns that don't exist, creating scandal where there is none. I'm seeing evidence of systematic rape and the deliberate destruction of families," Augustine said. "I'm seeing powerful men who used their positions to commit crimes and then used their influence to erase any record of those crimes from public knowledge." The silence that followed was heavy. The silver-haired man stood, his movements deliberate. "You're a long way from Massachusetts, Mr. Devereaux, a long way from home. This city can be dangerous for outsiders who don't understand how things work. Accidents happen, people get hurt, and if those people have made allegations against prominent families, well, who's going to believe them? Who's going to care?" After they left, Mrs. Fontenot emerged from the kitchen. Her face was grim. "You need to be careful. Those men, they're not making empty threats. I know their type. They think they own this city, own everyone in it." "I won't be intimidated," Augustine said, though his hands were shaking. "It's not about intimidation. It's about power." She sat down across from him. "My mother's mother, she knew secrets about the family she worked for. Names of children, who their real fathers were. She thought knowing those secrets made her valuable, protected. It didn't. One day she was there, the next day she was gone. The family said she'd run away. But her body turned up 3 months later, miles away. Nobody investigated. Nobody cared. Because she was nobody, and they were somebody. The threats had their effect." Augustine became more careful, varying his routes, keeping his notes hidden, watching for followers. But he didn't stop working. If anything, the intimidation made him more determined. These families thought they could control truth through fear, could bury their crimes under threats and money. He would prove them wrong, but the obstacles multiplied. His access to the courthouse archives became increasingly restricted. The new supervisor, a heavy-set man who had replaced the previous administrator with suspicious suddenness, required written authorization for every document request. Simple pulls that used to take minutes now took days. Entire categories of records became unavailable for preservation maintenance. And then Thibodeau disappeared. It happened in mid-September. Augustine arrived at the courthouse to find a different clerk at the desk, a young man who barely looked old enough to shave. "Mr. Thibodeau no longer works here," the young man said when Augustine asked. "He resigned for personal reasons." "What personal reasons?" "I wasn't told. I just started yesterday." Augustine tried to find Thibodeau at his home, but the address led to a boarding house where the landlord said Thibodeau had moved out 2 days ago, left no forwarding address, paid his rent through the end of the month, and disappeared. His neighbors knew nothing. It was as if he had simply vanished from the city. Levesque learned through his network that Thibodeau had been given a choice: leave New Orleans permanently or face charges of theft and document falsification. The charges would be manufactured, but they would stick. The clerk had taken his family, a wife and 2 young children, and left for Texas, carrying with him the knowledge of what was hidden in the courthouse basement, but no longer willing to risk everything to expose it. Without Thibodeau's help, Augustine's work ground nearly to a halt. The new clerk either couldn't or wouldn't help him navigate the archives. Document requests got lost. Materials were misfiled. The work that had flowed smoothly for months suddenly became impossible. In late September, Augustine received a letter from the Massachusetts Historical Society. It was cordial but firm. His funding had run out. The project had taken longer than anticipated. He needed to conclude his research and return home. Reading between the lines, Augustine understood that pressure had been applied from Louisiana to Massachusetts, that the concerned parties had influence that reached far beyond New Orleans. He had perhaps a month left, possibly less if they decided to recall him immediately. He spent every available hour with Levesque, compiling everything they'd found into a comprehensive archive. They organized the documents chronologically, created indices, wrote detailed explanations of the coding system. They photographed hundreds of pages, made multiple copies, stored them in different locations across the city. "Even if they destroy everything in the courthouse," Levesque said, "we'll have this. We'll have proof." But proof of what? Crimes committed 50 years ago by men who were dead. Augustine was beginning to understand that documenting the truth wasn't the same as achieving justice. The powerful families would deny everything, would use their lawyers and their newspapers to discredit any accusations. The people who had suffered, the mothers sold away, the children scattered, the families destroyed, would remain nameless footnotes in a history that preferred to forget them. Still, he worked, because even if he couldn't achieve justice, he could preserve the record. Someone someday might care. In his final weeks, Augustine focused on documenting individual stories, the human lives behind the coded numbers. He spent hours with the people Levesque brought, recording their testimonies in careful handwriting. He took photographs, collected letters, transcribed family histories. Marie Toussaint showed him a trunk that had belonged to her grandmother, filled with scraps of fabric, buttons, pieces of lace, materials salvaged from the big house at Belle Grove. "My grandmother said these were pieces of my mother," Marie explained. "The clothes she sewed, the curtains she hemmed. After she was sold away, my grandmother collected these things, kept them like relics. So, my mother wouldn't be completely erased." Philippe Arnaud shared letters written by his grandfather after emancipation, desperate attempts to find the mother who had been sold to Texas. "He never found her," Philippe said. "He wrote to plantations, to merchants, to anyone who might have records. Nobody responded. It was like she had never existed." Catherine Broussard showed Augustine her great-grandmother's ledgers, the private archive that had tracked births and deaths and sales with the same meticulous detail as the official records. "She was literate," Catherine explained, taught herself by watching the master's children at their lessons. She knew that if she didn't write it down, if there wasn't some record, the truth would disappear entirely. So she wrote, in secret, in the margins, in hiding. She wrote so we would know. These stories, Augustine realized, were the truth the official records could never capture. The coded numbers documented crimes, but they didn't convey the human cost. The mothers who never saw their children again, the children who grew up not knowing their parentage, the families shattered by people who saw them as property. On his last night in New Orleans, Levesque took him to a cemetery in the Treme neighborhood. They walked past elaborate tombs with names carved in marble, past mausoleums that housed generations of prominent families. They walked until they reached a section of simple markers, many without names, some just wooden crosses slowly rotting in the humid air. "This is where a lot of them ended up," Levesque said. "The ghost children who didn't survive, or who died without anyone to claim them. No names, no dates, just forgotten." He knelt beside one marker and brushed away fallen leaves. The wood was weathered, the paint faded, but Augustine could make out a date, 1847. Nothing else. "My mother's buried here," Levesque said quietly. "She died 5 years ago. I could have buried her in a better cemetery, could have afforded a stone marker with her name. But she wanted to be here, with the others. She said this was where she belonged, with the people who shared her history, who carried the same secrets." He stood, his expression unreadable in the darkness. She never wanted to talk about it, about who her father was. She said acknowledgement would make the shame real. As long as it stayed unspoken, she could pretend it didn't define her. But it did define her. It defined all of us. We're the children of crimes that nobody wants to remember. "I'll make sure the records survive," Augustine promised. "I'll make sure someone knows." "Will you publish?" Levesque asked. "Will you tell the world what you found?" Augustine had been wrestling with that question for months. Publication would mean professional destruction, would invite lawsuits and threats, might accomplish nothing. The powerful families would deny everything, would use their resources to suppress the story. But silence meant letting them win, meant allowing the architecture of concealment to continue protecting them. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'll preserve it. And when the time is right, when it can't be suppressed, yes, the truth will come out." Augustine Devereaux left New Orleans in October of 1891, carrying with him 3 trunks filled with documents, photographs, and testimonies. The city seemed to exhale as he departed, relieved to see the troublesome researcher gone. But the truth didn't come out, not in Augustine's lifetime or for decades after. He returned to Massachusetts determined to publish a comprehensive account, to force a reckoning with the crimes he had documented. But the obstacles proved insurmountable in ways he hadn't anticipated. Publishers rejected the work immediately. "Too inflammatory," they said, "insufficiently sourced, likely to provoke lawsuits." Academic journals questioned his methodology, suggested he had misinterpreted administrative codes, imposed modern sensibilities on historical practices. "You can't prove paternity," one editor wrote. "All you have are birth records and numbers. The connection to specific men is speculation, not fact." Letters arrived from lawyers representing the Louisiana families, thick envelopes containing threats of legal action if he proceeded with publication. Defamation, they claimed, libel against the deceased, deliberate falsification of historical records. The letters were detailed, professional, and absolutely serious in their threats to destroy him financially and professionally if he continued. The Massachusetts Historical Society, under pressure from donors with connections to the South, quietly asked Augustine to abandon the project. "We appreciate your dedication," the director told him over lunch at a private club. "But the society can't be associated with what amounts to unverifiable scandal. You've done important work documenting record-keeping practices, administrative systems. Focus on that. Leave the more inflammatory interpretations aside." When Augustine refused, they suggested a leave of absence, indefinite, unpaid. He understood the message. Stop this research or lose your position. He spent the next 5 years working independently, living off savings, growing increasingly isolated. He contacted newspapers, hoping investigative journalists might take up the story. But even the reform-minded papers hesitated. "It's 50 years old," one editor said. "Everyone involved is dead or dying." What's the public interest? What's the story beyond historical scandal? He tried abolitionist organizations, groups that had fought slavery and might care about its legacies. But even they were cautious. "We've moved on," they told him. "The fight now is about voting rights, about economic opportunity, about building a future. Digging up the past, it won't help the living. It will only open old wounds." Frustrated and increasingly desperate, Augustine began to understand what Thibodeau and Lévesque had tried to tell him. Some truths were too dangerous to speak, not because they weren't real, but because too many people had invested in keeping them hidden. The machinery of silence was too powerful, too entrenched, too well-funded to be overcome by one researcher with boxes of documents. In 1894, Augustine received word that two of the men he had numbered, Judge Sinclair and Senator Valmont, had died within months of each other. Their obituaries in the New Orleans papers were glowing tributes to public service, civic virtue, dedicated family men who had shaped Louisiana's legal and political landscape. No mention of the children scattered across plantations, of the mothers sold away, of the crimes committed under cover of official authority. He wrote letters to the editors, pointing out what their obituaries omitted. None of them were published. In 1896, Jacques Lévesque wrote to him from New Orleans. The letter was brief and devastating. The courthouse had a fire. Small, contained quickly by the fire brigade, but it destroyed the section where the slave records were kept. Arson, certainly, though no one will say so officially. I tried to get in afterward to see what survived. Everything we copied, those are the only records that exist now. If you don't preserve them, if you don't find a way to make them matter, no one will ever know this happened. Augustine had been keeping the documents in a warehouse he rented on the outskirts of Boston, carefully catalogued and stored in fireproof cabinets. After receiving Lévesque's letter, he spent weeks organizing everything into a single comprehensive archive. The original documents, the photographs, the testimonies, his own detailed analysis of the patterns and codes. He donated it to the Massachusetts Historical Society with strict instructions. The archive was to be sealed for 50 years, released only when everyone involved was dead, when the truth could emerge without destroying living people. He believed that in 50 years, in 1946, the country would be ready to confront this history, that the power of the Louisiana families would have waned enough that the truth could be told. The society accepted the donation and filed it away. Augustine died in 1903, believing that someday someone would open those archives and bring the story to light. But archives have a way of getting lost. The documents were moved during a renovation in 1910, transferred to a new building in 1923, reorganized during the Depression. By the time the 50-year seal expired in 1946, no one remembered what the boxes contained or why they mattered. They sat in storage, gathering dust, their secrets locked inside handwriting that fewer and fewer people could read, notation systems that had no context, photographs of people whose names had been forgotten. Decades passed. The civil rights movement fought for dignity and equality, but the specific crimes documented in Augustine's archive remained hidden. The families that had been implicated, some still prominent in Louisiana, others dispersed across the country, never had to answer for what their ancestors had done. The mothers who had been sold away, the children who had been scattered, the systematic destruction of families, it all remained buried in boxes that nobody opened. In 1978, a graduate student researching 19th-century record-keeping practices stumbled across Augustine's archive. She spent weeks going through the documents, trying to understand what she was looking at. The coded numbers, the detailed descriptions, the patterns of births and sales. None of it made sense until she found Augustine's explanatory notes, his careful documentation of what each number meant, who the men were, what the system had been designed to accomplish. She brought her findings to her advisor, excited by the historical significance. Her advisor looked through the documents, read Augustine's analysis, and then closed the boxes. "This is dynamite," he said. "But it's also unprovable. We have numbers and correlations. We don't have confessions or contemporary accounts. If you publish this, you'll be accused of fabricating scandal. You'll destroy your career before it starts. But it's true, the student protested. Truth isn't enough, her advisor said. Not when you're accusing prominent families of atrocities. Not when the evidence is circumstantial. Put it back in the archives. Maybe someday someone will figure out how to tell this story without getting destroyed for it. The student, needing to finish her dissertation and build her career, took his advice. She filed the boxes back in storage and wrote her dissertation on uncontroversial administrative practices. The archive was forgotten again, and that's where it remains, in storage at the Massachusetts Historical Society, waiting for someone to ask the right questions, to connect the patterns, to understand what Augustine Devereaux spent years documenting. The evidence of systematic abuse by some of Louisiana's most powerful men, the coded records that tracked crimes while maintaining deniability, the photographs and testimonies of people whose existence was supposed to remain invisible. It's all there, preserved but hidden, true but untold. The newspapers never reported it. Not in the 1840s when it was happening, not in the 1890s when Augustine tried to expose it, not in the decades since. The architecture of silence that protected those men in life continues to protect their memory in death. The families have gone on, maintaining their positions, building their legacies, never having to acknowledge the foundation of crime and exploitation those legacies were built upon. And the ghost children, the descendants of those numbered births, scattered across the country, carrying in their features the evidence of crimes that powerful men committed. Most of them don't know their own history. The records that could tell them who their ancestors were, what was done to their families, remain sealed in boxes that nobody opens. This isn't a story with a satisfying conclusion. There was no reckoning, no justice, no moment when truth triumphed over power. The crimes were committed, documented in coded language, and then successfully buried beneath layers of silence, denial, and institutional protection. The people who suffered, the mothers, the children, the families, were erased from history except as numbers in ledgers that nobody reads. Augustine Devereaux found the evidence. Jacques Levesque preserved the stories. Together they built a comprehensive archive that proved, beyond reasonable doubt, what had happened in those plantations outside New Orleans. And it didn't matter. The machinery of power that enabled those crimes was strong enough to suppress the truth for generations. Maybe someday that will change. Maybe someone will finally open those boxes, connect the patterns, tell the stories of the ghost children who looked like senators and judges. Maybe the families will finally have to confront what their ancestors did. Maybe the newspapers that ignored these crimes for so long will finally report them. But I wouldn't count on it. Because the lesson of this story isn't that truth always comes out. It's that power protects power, that silence can be more durable than stone, and that some crimes are committed so openly, documented so meticulously, that hiding them requires nothing more than everyone agreeing not to look. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried in the archives of old southern cities? Are there stories your own community has chosen to forget? Truths that were too uncomfortable to acknowledge? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.